Today, we're diving into two huge Supreme Court tax rulings. And trust me, they really pull back the curtain on this high-stakes game that's always being played between taxpayers and the government. This is a story all about the limits of power and, as you'll see, what can happen when the clock simply runs out. You know, this quote from the Supreme Court itself just perfectly sets the stage. It gets right to the heart of the matter. The government needs taxes to function, right? They're the lifeblood. But, and this is a big but, that power isn't unlimited. So the real question is, where exactly is that boundary? Where do you draw the line?
Okay, so to really get a grip on these cases, let's frame it like a game, a big match. In one corner, you've got the taxman, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, or the BIR. In the other corner, you have the taxpayer. And right in the middle, wearing the black and white stripes, you've got the referee, the Supreme Court.
All right, let's ring the bell for round one. This first case is all about the limits of the taxman's power. It was a major showdown, really, between the country's biggest banks and the BIR. And this fight, it's all about substance. Who was fundamentally right and who was wrong? So the whole thing kicked off back in 2011. The BIR suddenly dropped this new rule, Revenue Regulations 4/2011, and it completely changed the game for how banks had to account for their expenses. We're talking specifically about how they were supposed to separate the costs for their regular banking versus their foreign currency operations. So how did this new rule actually work? Well, it basically forced banks into this really rigid two-step process. First, any cost that could be directly tied to one unit, they had to assign it there. Simple enough. But then, and this is the tricky part, for all the shared costs, things like the CEO's salary or the rent on the main office, they were forced to use the BIR's single mandatory formula. Just like that, any flexibility they had in their own accounting was gone. And right here, this is the core of the whole fight. You see, the actual tax code, the law passed by Congress, says taxpayers can choose any accounting method that fairly shows their income. But then you have the BIR, which is an administrative agency, coming in and saying, nope, forget that. You have to use our method and only our method. You can already see the collision course they were on. So, of course, the banks fought back, and the whole thing went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The court looked at it and sided with the banks, saying the BIR's action was ultra vires. Now, that's a really important legal term. It literally means beyond the powers. Basically, the court said the BIR tried to do something it had absolutely no legal authority to do. So the Supreme Court just invalidated the whole regulation. The referee made the call, and it was loud and clear. The BIR overstepped its bounds. The court reinforced a huge principle here. An agency's job is to implement the laws that legislators write, not to invent new laws from the sidelines. For the taxpayer, this was a massive win, based purely on the substance of the argument. Now, let's pivot to our second case, because it paints a very different picture. This time, the problem isn't something the government did wrong. Nope, this time it's about a taxpayer who just ran out of time. This round is all about procedure. I mean, think about that for a second. That's exactly what happened to LANDBANK. They were handling a transaction on a foreclosed property, and somehow they paid the documentary stamp tax twice, sent over the exact same 2.3 million pesos 2 separate times. A pretty obvious and very expensive mistake. Now, this timeline is everything. It's the key to the entire case. LANDBANK made that mistaken second payment way back in May 2002. According to the tax code, that started a 2-year clock to ask for a refund. So their absolute deadline was May 2004. But they didn't actually file their claim until May 2005, more than a full year too late. The entire case really came down to this one number, 2. 2 years. The tax code is incredibly clear about this deadline. It's not a suggestion, it's strict, it's absolute, and it's non-negotiable. It doesn't matter why you were late. The law says if you miss that window, your chance is gone. And it's not just to be difficult, it's about stability. The government has to be able to finalize its budget, and it can't have old refund claims popping up years and years later. So LANDBANK's lawyers tried to get creative. They argued that a more general principle from the civil code, something called solutio in debiti, should apply. It basically deals with any payment by mistake and gives you a much longer 6-year window. They were hoping that this general rule could override the specific tax rule and save their claim. But the Supreme Court completely shut that argument down. They pointed to a really fundamental principle of law. A special law will always, always trump a general one. And since the tax code is a special law written just for tax issues, its 2-year deadline is the only one that matters. The general rule from the civil code? Irrelevant. The clock had simply run out. Game over. So let's bring these two stories back together. We've got one taxpayer who won big and another who lost, even though they were technically in the right. And by comparing them side by side, we can really see this crucial lesson the Supreme Court is teaching us about substance versus procedure. Look, it's so clear when you see it like this. In that first case, the banks won on substance. The government's rule was just plain wrong. It was illegal. But in the second case, LANDBANK lost on procedure. Yeah, their claim was substantively correct. They absolutely paid twice, but they failed to follow the rules of the game. They missed that critical 2-year deadline.
So what's the big lesson here? What does all of this mean for the rest of us, not just giant banks? Well, it really shines a light on the fundamental balance of power and responsibility that our entire legal system is built on.
On one hand, our system has these powerful built-in checks to stop the government from going too far. Agencies can't just make up their own rules whenever they feel like it. They have to play within the lines drawn by the law. That is the substance protection, and it's exactly why the banks won their case. But, and this is just as important, it's a two-way street. The system also demands that we as citizens are diligent. The law gives us rights, it gives us ways to fix problems, but it almost always attaches strict rules and deadlines to them. To use your rights, you have to follow the procedure, and that is precisely why LANDBANK, with a completely valid claim, walked away with absolutely nothing. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. In this incredibly complex game of law and taxes, what really matters more? Having the right argument or making that argument at the right time? Because as these cases clearly show, having one without the other can mean the difference between winning and losing. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.